Hello, welcome to this presentation about Antlered gods, Celtic mythology. Now, a sanity warning before we get going. I'm not an academic, and I'm not presenting any dogma at all. What I am is an enthusiast, but I've been interested in Arthurian mythology, going to touch on Merlin, and Celtic mythology for 40 years or so. So, I know a thing or two, but I'm not an academic. What I am is an artist. And as an artist, I'm very interested in symbolism, because symbolism and the meaning of symbols is crucial if you're interested in creating iconography of Celtic gods and goddesses, so what do symbols mean? What do antlers mean? And what do bull's horns means, and ram's horns and goat's horns and stuff, so here's a presentation of ideas. That's all they are, just ideas of what some of the Celtic iconography could represent. Now, I'm going to do it with a PowerPoint presentation, got lots of pictures to show. So I'm just going to bring the PowerPoint up. Okay, so now let's get started. So simplistically, I call this topic horns of power, and the horns are a headdress. You can take them literally and think they really are goat-headed gods or ram-headed gods or antler-headed gods. Or you can see it shamanic as representative of old symbolism from the most ancient of times. That's all fine. But I'm going to give some logic from the mystery traditions first, and then look at Celtic reasoning as an idea as well. And then we're going to look at some old medieval stories that shed light on things. Now, so horns of power, just to look at the classical world first, there are two primary types of horns used in ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, and they are goat's horns and ram's horns. Okay, so this is Capricorn. Capricorn literally translates as goat's horn, and the importance of Capricorn is that it's the time of year when the winter solstice happens. When the sun enters Capricorn, that is winter solstice. That's the rebirth of the light, and those goat's horns are very important for that symbolism. If in the top right-hand corner, you'll see Pan playing his pipes. Pan always has goat's horns. He's a goat-foot god, a goat-legged god with goat's horns. He's part goat, he's part Capricorn. His name means all, everything. Pan means all and everything. But the goat's horns represent the return of the light at the winter solstice. That's basic symbolism there. Now, the other zodiac sign that was used by the ancient world is Aries. Aries is the ram, and the ram's horns of Aries represent the spring equinox. When the sun enters the sign of Aries, it's the spring equinox. So there's two times of year that are being represented by either goat's horns or ram's horns. That's the winter solstice or the spring equinox. So look at this figure. At first glance, you might think, oh, it's Pan, but it's not. These are ram's horns. And this is actually a form of Zeus. And he's borrowed the ram's horns of an Egyptian god called Amun, or Amun-Ra. Amun always had ram's horns. So this is a hybrid. This is Zeus Ammon. Zeus Ammon. It's Zeus wearing the horns of Ammon, wearing the ram's horns. Looks like Pan, but it's not. You have to know whether you're looking at goat's horns or ram's horns, whether they're representing winter solstice or spring equinox. Now, the Celts did something similar, but slightly different. They used two other types of horns to represent different times of the year. Now, I'll talk us through that. This is a Romano-Celtic icon from Gaul, around about 3rd century, 4th century, and it's an icon of Cernunnos, the antler-headed god. Now, if you look above the central figure's head, you can see his antlers have been smashed away, probably by early Christians, you know, but the stunts are there on his forehead, and you can see along the kind of shelf above his head where the antlers would have touched the shelf, you know. I've done a redrawing of this to show it in better detail, but he's positioned between Apollo on the left and Mercury on the right. It's a hybrid of Roman mystery traditions and a Celtic deity, Cernunnos, you know. Now, there's only one place in the year where Apollo, the sun, and Mercury are side by side, and that's on the cusp between the sign of Leo and Virgo. I won't go into that any further, but at that Leo-Virgo cusp is really important for the ancient mystery traditions. If you go on the Facebook group, the Owen Grove, and go into the files section, there's a load of free PDF files. One of them is called Star-Lord Basics and the Rites of Cauldron. Now, if you read that, you'll understand the importance of this cusp between Leo and Virgo as the starting point for the ancient mysteries. So it's very interesting that Cernunnos is sitting in that doorway, if you like. Now, here's my redrawing. I traced it and coloured it in, and I put the antlers back. So this is more akin to how it would have looked back in the day. It would have been painted, you know, so I've just gone with kind of earthy pigment-based colours. Now, for what we're looking at, the times of year, like with the classical world, winter solstice and spring equinox with goat's horns and ram's horns, below Cernunnos, there is a red bull and a white stag. Now, the best theory about this red bull and white stag is that they represent two different halves of the year. The logic is this, that the bull is a domesticated animal. It's the animal used for farming, and farming is a summer activity, spring and summer activity, you know. So the bull was used as a tractor. It helped plough the fields and so on, you know. So you need that bull to do your agricultural, domesticated, civilized lifestyle in the summertime. The white stag, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's not domesticated, it's wild, you know, it's untamed. And in the ancient days, after the farming was over, after the harvest had been brought in, the only other food available until the next harvest really was hunting. You know, yeah, hunting, and whether it's hunting boar or other animals, but the stag represents the ultimate hunting, and it's used again in different stories. Now, logic for hunting in the winter is you don't want to go hunting in the summertime because you'll be trampling all over the crops, you know, chasing a stag could run into the crop field, you know, so you don't want to do that. Also, hunting is easier in the winter because the trees are bare. The deciduous trees have dropped their leaves. It's easier to see your prey in the forest. Whereas when the trees are all green, there's so much camouflage, it's hard to see the prey. So hunting is easier in the winter. It's necessary because there's no more farming to do, you know, and it's also kind of like a natural culling, you know, the deers that are going to get killed are going to be the old or the lame. They're going to be the easiest ones to hunt, you know, as sad as it is. Now, that's the logic for the bull and the stag representing the winter time and the summertime, you know. So just as the classical world represented winter solstice and spring equinox, the theory is that Celts saw the year divided into two halves. The summer half was the time of the bull's horns, and the winter half was the time of the antlers, you know, winter solstice. And there's some star law logic to that as well. But this isn't just on the Reims altar in Gaul, it's also on the Gundestrup Cauldron. So here's Cernunnos again, and if you look to the left of him, you'll see the stag and the bull. So this is deliberate. It's not chance that this wonderful cauldron found in Denmark would show Cernunnos with a stag and bull a long time before the Celts of Gaul had Cernunnos with a stag and a bull. So, you know, for whatever logic, these are the motifs that accompany Cernunnos along with his antlers, you know. And here on the Gundestrup Cauldron, the stag is closer to Cernunnos. The bull is kind of in the background. So it's kind of like it's the time of the stag, it's the winter time, and the male figure is wearing the horns of the winter time, you know. Curiously, the stag and Cernunnos, their horns are making a W shape. And I think that's quite deliberate. I think it's a reference to the mother goddess. Now, if you look on the YouTube channel for the great mother goddess of the Celts, it will explain the W shape and its star law of the goddess at the center of the night sky. Also on the Gundestrup Cauldron, there's a bull horned figure. On the left here, I've got a close-up, bit blurry. But look at this, it's a figure with bull's horns, and he's holding a wheel, or actually he's holding half a wheel, as if he's holding half of a year cycle. You know, like half the wheel belongs to the bull's horns, that kind of idea. It's curious, not dogma. See, these are just patterns of symbolism. Now, the night sky, then a quickie. The central stars are ever present, and on the pale blue streak, you'll see the W shape. That's the mother goddess that I referred to. And in the top of the picture, there's a triangle called the summer triangle that relates to the night sky in the summertime. But what I want to point out is the bottom. The bottom is this hexagonal shape known as the winter hexagon, hexagram. And simplistically, it represents the winter hunter and his hound. Now, the winter hunter and his hound is really important. This is the star story in the northern hemisphere for the winter time. So if you combine this with the stag and the antlers representing the winter time, then the winter hunter would fit having antlers because he'd be wearing the horns of the winter months. You know, that the winter hunter wears antlers, whereas a summer farmer is going to wear bull's horns. You know, the agricultural man is going to wear bull's horns. The wild man is going to wear stag antlers. And that's an esoteric idea that can go a long way, you know, that all of us are both, you know, that in the civilized world, there's a domestic, civilized aspect of self, you know, correct behavior, how to get on with people, and so on. And yet inside of us also there is the wild-hearted, antlered fairy world, you know, that we are both, you know, and the outer world, the everyday world, can be seen as the summer world, the mortal realm, civilized, domesticated realm. But the realm of our dreams and visions, that's the wild, you know, into the wild, following the stag, following the white hart. They're wonderful ideas of the duality of the year. That's also the duality of our nature, that we are both domesticated and wild-hearted, you know, the bull and the stag. It's not unique to men, antlers, you know, so an antlered male figure could represent a god of the wintertime, but contemporary with the Reims altar of Cernunnos and other Cernunnos icons in ancient Gaul, there are at least these two female figures with antlers, and they're from the same place and the same time, really. They're from Gaul, 3rd century, 4th century. So what is she? Who is she? It's a female goddess or figure or shaman wearing the horns of power of the wintertime. So she's a goddess of the wintertime, you know, or she, you know, goddess of the wild as well, you know. The one on the right, she's holding a cornucopia, which is the horn of plenty. And that horn of plenty can also relate to Capricorn, the goat's horn, you know, offering in her other hand with the dish, you know, it's called a patera. She's offering abundance and fruitfulness during the winter solstice, you know, at the darkest night, darkest time of the year. She's a figure of, you know, there's abundance, there more is coming, you know. So is she a representation of nature, you know, the fecundity of nature? No idea. These are just ideas, but there is evidence from Gaul at the same time of a god and goddess with antlers, an antlered lord and lady, if you like. There's no icons of them both together, but they are there in the same culture or at the same time. Now, one theory is that she, the goddess, is Mother Nature herself, or the divine feminine of the land, and that winter and summer have to win her for their times of the year. You know, this is played out in many Beltane traditions when the Oak King and the Holly King battle to win the May Queen, that kind of idea, you know. So a friend of mine, Alan Royce, did this piece of artwork some years ago, but it shows on the left-hand side an antler-headed figure fighting a bull's-headed figure, you know, and they're fighting over the goddess of the land. That's the idea, that they're trying to win her favors or her love for their time of the year. Now, they're great ideas. And this is a wonderful thing. This is from the 7th century, and this was written by the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, you know, and he's complaining. Now, this is what he wrote. Anyone who goes about as a stag or a bull, that is, making himself into a wild animal and dressing in the skin of a herd animal and putting on the heads of beasts, those who in such wise transform themselves into the appearance of a wild animal, a penance for 3 years, because this is devilish. Wonderful. You know, this shows that 300 years after the Cernunnos icon of Gaul with the stag and the bull, that 300 years later, when people are meant to have been Christianized, people are still wearing stags' antlers and bull's horns, you know, for their pagan celebrations or whatever, you know, much to the disdain of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I would argue, and I'll show some more pictures, that, you know, the motif of the antlered lord as a lover or consort of the goddess of nature is an ongoing thing. It never faded away. Christianity never succeeded in erasing it. You know, it just went underground and shape-shifted between the centuries amongst the country folk and their folk customs, you know. So here's a story from Ireland. You know, there's another video on the YouTube channel about Ellen of the Ways, and if you look at that, it shows some of the evidence for the sovereignty goddess of the land to represent as one of her main animal motifs a deer, you know, and this idea of a deer goddess can be traced right back to ancient Siberia and shamanic times. Simplistically, in Ireland and in Wales, it corresponds indirectly with the sovereignty goddess of the land. Now, in Ireland, there was a folk hero, a demigod called Finn McCool, and a superhuman. He threw a great big amount of soil into the Irish Sea, so big that it formed the Isle of Man. You know, so this isn't a historical human being, this is a superhuman demigod, you know. But in his story, apart from getting wisdom from the salmon of wisdom, he falls in love with a fairy woman who had been magically transformed into a deer, you know. So she's a fairy woman, i.e. she's a spirit of nature, and she is transformed into a deer until she makes it to Finn McCool's kingdom and becomes human formed, and they become lovers and marry, you know, and they have a child as well. It's a famous story. Her name, one of those wonderful Irish names that who would know how to pronounce it. So it can be spelled S-A-D-B-H, S-A-D-B, S-A-D-H-B-H, you know. You wouldn't know by looking at it how it's pronounced. Her name is pronounced Sive, like sigh, S-I-G-H, Sive, and it means sweet and lovely. So the fairy maiden who was transformed into a deer by an evil druid is Sive, sweet and lovely. They are happily married, you know, for a while, and then misfortune happens and she is taken away from Finn McCool. But meanwhile, she's got pregnant. But it's a case of Finn McCool, or a king, leader of men, and he's a wild hunter actually, marrying a deer goddess. And years later, after she is taken away from him, Finn finds a young lad and he recognizes her features in the boy, and his own features, and he realizes that the little boy is their son, you know, and he names him Oisin, and Oisin becomes one of the most famous poets in ancient Ireland, a lot like the British Taliesin, you know, he's that kind of high-level poet. And the name Oisin means little deer, fawn, you know, because his mother had been a deer fairy, a deer spirit, you know. So Finn McCool too must have been indirectly a stag man, because his love was a deer and his son was a little deer. Indirectly, that makes Finn McCool, the Stag man. Now, coming to Arthurian romance, and this is from the Vita Merlini, the Life of Merlin, which was written round about 1150 AD by Geoffrey of Monmouth. And this Life of Merlin is the oldest of the Merlin romances, apart from Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is only 20 years earlier and by the same author. The Life of Merlin tells the story of Merlin going mad and running away to the Caledonian forest. It's on the border between Scotland and Britain, and living in the forest as a wild man because he loses it. We'd say post-traumatic stress disorder or something. There was a famous battle called the Battle of Arthdereth, and it was a civil war. Britons fighting Britons rather than fighting their enemy, the Saxons, and seeing all the bloodshed of Britons fighting Britons and the waste of life, so much so that Britain could no longer defend itself against the invading Saxons. Merlin went mad. You know, after all his years of trying to protect the land, he lost it. And so he ran to the forest and lived there as a wild man. So I'm going to read a couple of passages, because a lot of people think they know the Merlin story because they know later versions of it. They don't know the original stories. No, they know Thomas Mallory or Tennyson, things like that. So this is at the battle when he loses the plot and goes mad. The fury seized him, and he departed secretly and fled to the woods, not wishing to be seen as he fled. He entered the wood and rejoiced to lie hidden under the ash trees. He marvelled at the wild beasts feeding on the grass of the glades. Now he chased after them, and again he flew past them. He lived on the roots of grasses and on the grass, on the fruit of the trees and on the mulberries of the thicket. He became a sylvan man, just as though devoted to the woods. A sylvan man is like the Celtic god Sylvanus, the god of the forests, protector of the forests. So here Merlin has lived in the forest and become a sylvan man, like Sylvanus. And for a whole summer after this, hidden like a wild animal, he remained buried in the woods, found by no one and forgetful of himself and of his kindred. Her story unfolds now near the Caledonian forest where he's living as a wild man. His sister is living at Dunbarton Rock, the Rock of the Clyde, and which is on the edge of the Caledonian forest. Anyway, there's some communication eventually between Merlin and his sister. Now, Merlin had been a king of South Wales, from the Carmarthen area, which is meant to be named after him. Carmarthen is one of the 3 Roman towns of Ellen, you know, the goddess of the land. So he was the Dark Age king of southern Wales, and he had a wife in this story. But because he's mad and he's aware he's mad, he decides to let her go because he doesn't want to return to South Wales. He doesn't want to return to being a king. He's had enough of people, you know. So he gives his wife, Gwendolina, which has the elements of Ellen in the second part of the name, Gwendolina. Gwen just means white or fair, so Gwendolina can mean fair Ellen. It's derivative, similar. Anyway, he gives her permission to remarry, basically. He said, look, you just leave me in the wild, find yourself a new partner, you know. Anyway, the story unfolds and he agrees to take her, and that very unusual wedding day present for when she remarries, and that day comes. Now, this is where Merlin fulfills the symbolism of being a stag lord who had already been previously a king, and his wife's name has elements of Ellen, and he was king of one of Ellen's 3 cities. So this is him talking to himself in the forest. Perhaps Gwendolina has left me in my absence and now clings to another man and rejoices in his embraces. So I lose, so another enjoys her. So my rights are taken away from me while I dally. So it is surely, for a slothful lover is beaten by one who is not slothful, or absent but is right on hand. But I am not jealous. Let her marry now under favourable auspices, and let her enjoy her new husband with my permission. And when tomorrow's sun shall shine, I will go and take with me the gift I promised her when I left. So he spoke and went about all the woods and groves and collected a herd of stags in a single line, and the deer and the she-goats likewise. And he himself mounted a stag. And when the day dawned, he came quickly, driving the line before him to the place where Gwendolina was to be married. When he arrived, he forced the stags to stand patiently outside the gates while he cried aloud, Gwendolina, Gwendolina, come, your presents are looking for you. Gwendolina therefore came quickly, smiling and marvelling that the man was riding on the stag, and it obeyed him, and that he could get together so large a number of animals and drive them before him, just as a shepherd does the sheep, that he is in the habit of driving to the pastures. An amazing scene then. So there's a herd of stags and deer and goats, and Merlin riding the stag and bring them all to her. You know, quite tragically in the story, he's not recovered yet. He's still mad, you know, and he sees the bridegroom in the window of the castle or fort, and he can't contain himself, and it's quite horrible what happens next. The stag that Merlin is riding, Merlin rips off one of its antlers and throws the antler to the bridegroom in the window and kills him outright. And then Merlin turns all the animals around and gallops back into the wild forests and stuff, you know. Tragic story, really, but there's elements in it of Gwendolina being a goddess of the land. The ideal present for her is a load of deer, you know. Merlin himself, as a king, is trying to let her go, trying to let another male have her, you know, but in a fit of mad jealousy, he's unable to do it. The story continues, and Taliesin comes to Merlin in the Caledonian forest, you know, and talks sense to him. And as they're talking, a fresh spring of water comes out of the ground right next to them like a miracle. And Merlin drinks from this fresh water, and it cleanses him and takes all of his madness away, you know, so he's healed from his insanity. That and more details are in The Life of Merlin, or the Vita Merlini by Geoffrey Monmouth, and it's a very important read. There's a long debate about cosmology and the nature of reality between Taliesin and Merlin. You know, it's fascinating to read all of that, you know. From elsewhere in Welsh lore, at the end of his life, Merlin, assisted by Taliesin, went around gathering together the 13 treasures of Britain. And they gathered them so that these sacred treasures would not fall into the hands of their enemies, you know, the Saxons. And apparently Merlin hid the 13 treasures in the other world, outside of this world, you know, these sacred treasures of the Brythonic Celts. One of those treasures was the magical game of Gwyn, which is a sacred treasure of the goddess Ellen. You know, in the dream of Maxim Hledeg in the Mabinogion, her father is carving the pieces for this magical chess set, you know. So the Ellen connections with Merlin are, he was king of Carmarthen, one of her towns. His wife has Gwendolina, White Ellen or Fair Elena in her name. The ideal present for her is all these deer. And amongst the 13 treasures are the magical chess set that Ellen's father made. The intrigues there, things to research, but I digress. So simplistically then, the horned god, the antlered god, and the goddess of the land can just be seen as the divine feminine of nature, of course, you know, or the lord and lady of the other world, the fairy world. In Saxon, Elfhame, Lady Elfhame and her lord, you know, like Shakespeare's Oberon and Titania. Gets played out in many different sagas, you know. So one of them is Gwyn ap Neath. Gwyn ap Neath is a winter hunter god. So he's an antlered god, and he has a battle every Beltane against the Summer King over the hand of the goddess of nature, you know, locked into that kind of Oak King, Holly King battle every Beltane. And Herne the Hunter too, you know, both Gwyn ap Neath is a hunter of the wild hunt, and Herne the Hunter is a later Saxon version of the same thing, you know, this wild hunter with antlers on his head. Herne the Hunter can't be traced back much later than Shakespeare's writings, so sort of late 1500s really, and he's localized to Windsor Forest, but it's the same sort of antlered hunter, which is a winter hunter motif, you know, the hunter with the antlers. So this is it, the idea carrying on from Cernunnos in Gaul to the Archbishop of Canterbury complaining in the 7th century about people wearing stag's horns and bull's horns, to medieval stories about heroes and their deer-related love interests, Gwyn ap Neath, McCool, Merlin, Herne the Hunter, and right up into the 1600s, where there's the, you know, delving now into the continuation of folk traditions and folk magic, where Robin Goodfellow is represented in the 1630s as a horned deity, you know, more like Pan because he's more goat-like. So the kind of Celtic aspect has drifted aside. The antlers have just drifted away with the Celtic thing. This comes from medieval times onwards, you know, so it's been heavily influenced by the Norman French, and the Norman French are carrying the more classical Pan imagery of the goat's horns of the winter solstice. So a close-up of Robin Goodfellow shows him with the goat's legs and goat's horns, and he's also holding a torch, you know, which is often a symbol for the light, literally, you know, the light bringer. So it's the winter solstice and the return of the light. But by the 1630s, anything resembling Pan was considered devilish. I mean, it was considered devilish to the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 7th century, you know. Sadly, this depiction of Robin is from the, you know, time of the witchcraft hysteria, where people were being burnt for their non-Christian activities and their gods being considered the devil and so on. The name Robin is interesting. The witches of Somerset called their god Robin. And where does the name Robin come from? Well, it seems to come from the Norman French, and they wouldn't pronounce it Robin. Robin is how it looks written down, but in French, it would be Robin. Robin. The B-I-N has a ban sound to it. So that sounds more like Pan. So if you look at the image of Robin Goodfellow, think Robin, you know, curious. Again, no dogma, just looking at patterns and symbols. These folk traditions of horned deities carried on right through the centuries. So this is the famous Dorset Ouza from folk traditions, possibly a mummer's outfit, you know, which would have been a kind of old wassailing thing or a Midsummer's Day thing or a Beltane thing, but it's still, people love horns and antlers. And in the famous Abbott's Bromley horn dance, you know, folk tradition, pseudo-pagan origins, you know, that's continued right up until the modern day. People still celebrating with their antlers, even if they've forgotten its roots with Cernunnos right back in pre-Christian times, you know. Really interesting. And I think for the modern world, certainly for myself and people of my age group, you know, I'm in my early 50s now, and so I was a teenager in the 1980s, and we were very lucky. There was a fantastic television series in the 1980s called Robin of Sherwood, but the main magical element of Robin of Sherwood was the god of the forests, who in that TV series was called Herne the Hunter, you know. And this kind of, it was so pagan, it was so magical, combined with the music of Clannad, you know, it was so ethereal and otherworldly that I think it's had a massive impact on modern world paganism, you know. And for certain, the TV series was certainly inspired by the research of people like Margaret Murray, who is indirectly responsible for the horned god and Dianic traditions of modern day witchcraft and Wicca and stuff, you know. So anyway, I think one way or another, the antlered god never left us. It was never erased by Christianity. It was always there, beloved, loved by people, loved by anyone with a connection with the wild, you know. And the stag and the white hart and those motifs can be traced all through medieval stories and Arthurian stories, if not as a god with horns, then simply as the white hart, the white stag, is a recurring motif that the empress, who's really Ellen, you know, in the Arthurian stories, the two treasures of the empress, Lady Venus, the Rose Queen, Lady Elfheim, Titania, call her what you want, you know, but her two treasures, things that were most sacred to her, were the white hart and her magical chess set, Gwynthwyl. And Gwynthwyl means forest sense, wood sense, tree wisdom, wisdom of the forests. So anyway, more ideas like this are in my book, Gwyn, God of Annuin, Druidic Star Lore, and the Bardic Mysteries. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do. That would really help. And check out all the other videos. Thank you very much.